everybody. Welcome back for another brand new edition of Reasonable Doubt, brought to you by the Harris County Criminal Lawyers Association. I'm your host, Jimmy Ardoin, and tonight, my cohort, Julio, he's in trial, so he's not here. But filling in for him, Victoria.
Hi,
Professor
Jimmy.
Glue.
How are you?
Come out of the booth.
Yes, it's always exciting to be on this side of the action.
I'm excited to have you here because I think you've only been on the show with me once.
That's true.
Yeah.
We were supposed to talk about the DNA project, ended up talking about other things. It was a lot of fun.
Sometimes I get a little sidetracked.
It's okay.
Speaking of getting sidetracked and surprises coming up, you got married.
I did.
And didn't tell anybody.
It was a pop-up wedding.
I'm a little upset about this.
Well, it was.
I didn't have time to go to the registry, get you anything.
Don't worry. I'll give you all
time.
the info.
Okay.
I'll give you all the info. We'll have another second show celebration.
I need like a reception or something so that I can come and give you some sort of gift.
We'll make it happen.
Okay.
We'll make
Very
it happen.
good.
My pleasure.
Very good, very good. Well, I'm glad to have Victoria in the co-host seat tonight, and I'm really excited to have our guest here tonight, ladies and gentlemen, from the Houston Chronicle, one of their crime reporters, Keri Blakinger. Thanks for joining us. Are you here to defend the millennials after my trashing of them a couple weeks ago?
Yeah, I mean, I know there's this perception that we like build our houses out of avocados and stuff, but we don't, and we do notice when you trash us on the air.
I know. You know, I'm actually in that between gap, that gap generation. So I'm like, I could be considered by some people a millennial, but I'm not really. So they created that special generation for us. So I'm like right there.
So you just trash millennials on Twitter instead?
It was mainly Wayne that was trashing millennials. Let's be honest about that. But what about the mayonnaise thing? What's this whole mayonnaise thing about? I don't understand it.
I don't really care about mayonnaise.
What is the mayonnaise thing? I haven't heard of this.
Apparently
What is
we're
it?
killing mayonnaise.
Yeah.
I mean, along with all the other things that we've killed as a generation, we've also killed mayonnaise.
Because it's not healthy and we want to live longer? Is that?
I don't know, but mayonnaise, especially on a Chick-fil-A sandwich, is delicious. I don't know why you would pass that up.
Well, maybe once in a while, but probably shouldn't be a habit.
I'm not saying eat it every day.
Sounds awful, and I'm judging you right now.
I know. I'm sure you are. Because it's 2018 and that's what we do.
Is it like straws? Like straws are no good anymore.
Right?
So like
Plastic
mayonnaise.
bags and all that, yeah. It's probably along those same lines.
Yeah.
But we're going to have a great show tonight, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to be here for the next hour talking with Keri, and Victoria's going to get her opinions in as well, because we didn't let her do that all the way the last time she was on the show. We'll open up the phone lines probably about 8:30. 713-807-1794 is the number, so you can call in with questions and comments for us. Or you can hit us up on Twitter at HCCLA_TV. Keri, I want to start because a lot of people may not know you from our TV audience. Those of you who read the Chronicle and follow, the crime section, obviously, they'll know you. You've been very active in reporting. But why don't you give us a little bit about yourself and tell us about you, how you got here to Houston and what makes you tick, that sort of thing.
All right. Well, I came to Houston 2 years ago from the New York Daily News. And I started here with, general assignment and breaking news stuff. And then around a year in is when I got permanently hired full time. And at that point, our death row reporter had just left. So they were like, hey, do you want to fill in on prisons and death row? And prisons happened to be a really good fit for me because before I was a reporter, I did time in upstate New York. So so I get prisons.
Yeah, tell us about that, because I mean I've read your story. So, but tell us what happened and how you ended up actually serving time in prison.
Well, I was a heroin addict for like 9 or 10 years. So yeah, I got arrested with a lot of drugs on me.
And this was in college?
Yeah, this was in college. I had started using drugs when I was like 17 or 18. I'd been a competitive figure skater in high school, and then when I stopped doing that, I just fell apart and started doing drugs. And at the same time, like kind of started doing college for like 10 years, because it takes longer on heroin, as it turns out.
Who would have thought?
I know, right?
When is your book coming out? That sounds fascinating. What a trajectory. You have like
You
every
could write
facet.
the sequel to Orange is the New Black.
I guess it would be Green is the New Black, because they wore green in state prison in New York.
And then they do that here, I think, a lot too.
They wear white here at state prison.
That's right.
Yeah.
In the federal detention center downtown, they wear a combination of green or khaki.
Right.
Well, I mean, you know, so you transitioned from that. I think you were part of a Hearst Fellowship to come here?
Yes. Yeah.
How did that come about?
I applied. I was at the Daily News, and I wanted some broadsheet experience, and so I applied to the Hearst Fellowship, and I think that was actually the first time that I've applied to anything that asked if I was a felon and actually called me at all afterwards. Because I mean, I've applied tons of places, but in any other instance where they've ever had that little checkbox, I've never gotten like any second look or callback or anything. So yeah, I didn't really expect that something in Texas would be more progressive on that. Like,
what was your experience with them? Because I have a very good friend who's a public defender now in another state, and she had served some federal time. So I know from her experience, like getting her bar license in that state it took some work and some legal minds to help her do it. But as a reporter, as a journalist, what was that like? Did that inhibit you, or did that help you more? You feel like you said that was the only call that you got, but can you tell us a little bit about that?
yeah, I mean, I feel like it's really hard to guess how it works for or against you in something like reporting. Like, I know, I can tell that, I think it takes me more tries to apply for jobs than some of my colleagues. But in terms of like sourcing, it's hard to tell, because sometimes now that there's this sort of interest in more progressive takes on criminal justice, like there's sometimes where I think that prosecutors or police or defense lawyers are actually more interested in talking to me because of my background. And I'm sure there's sometimes that they haven't talked to me because they've held it against me, but it's hard to know when that's happening. But I mean, it's also, of course, really helpful just in terms of like the basics of understanding prison and prison experiences, because I mean, there's some things about doing time that are just universally true anywhere.
Right. I mean, I think that would help. I mean, I find that sometimes a reporter who has actually been in the situation that they're reporting on, they are able to really truly communicate and make the reader feel and understand what is actually happening. I mean, so often you see, for instance, I mean, we obviously as lawyers, we read a lot of stuff that's covered by people who aren't lawyers, and we're just like, well, that's not right. That's just not how it goes. I mean, that's just nowhere near the truth. And so, I mean, I read your stuff, and I think you add credibility to me as an author, because it's like, this is something that she's writing about that she probably knows about. And so I think from an authenticity standpoint, that was what really motivated me when I started following you on Twitter to go back and read a lot of your articles too. Because when I found out about your history and started reading, it's like, this girl knows what she's talking about. She's been there.
You mean you didn't follow me because of the profile picture with the mermaid tail?
Well, that too. It was that was absolutely. If we could figure out how to get that up, that'd be awesome. So what's the story behind the mermaid tail? I have to ask.
I wrote about mermaids once when I was in New York, and I really wanted to do it. I wanted to try. Like, it's hard. It's these like silicone tails that are like $2,000, and I had to find someone that was like roughly my size and could loan me a tail. And I found someone in Dallas, and I convinced a photographer from the Chronicle to drive up to Dallas with me so that I could be a mermaid. And I wrote an essay about it. So if you like Google my name and mermaid, I have an essay about like my effort to mermaid. I was bad at it. I fell out of a pool. I actually fell out of the pool.
I'm always looking for new subjects to Google, so Keri Blakinger and mermaid will be top on my list.
Is there like a philosophical reason behind it?
No, I mean, the people
reporter?
are professional mermaids, and they do like birthday parties and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And so I was just writing about it as like an emerging trend type thing.
When you before you went to prison, before you got arrested, did you know you wanted to be a reporter and a journalist, or what were you hoping to be prior to that?
Well, growing up, I wanted to be a lawyer at one point, but obviously that was
Bless your heart.
But I feel like you're so close
Bless your
now. I feel like you're very close in your profession. I mean, with the interviews and the work that you do, criminal justice work that you do.
I mean, I spend a lot of time reading briefs, so you wouldn't know the difference some days.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to take the bar exam.
Right. Yes. Thank God. I mean, that would be difficult in some states. I certainly wouldn't want to try that in Texas.
No, you know
I don't
what?
think you can in Texas.
I think they would make. I think they look at every individual case.
But then you pay for law school, you take on all that debt, and you
And then
run
you
the
don't know.
risk of
Right.
having to litigate it for a year and a half, like that woman in Washington.
No, it's true. I mean, it's very true. Aside from the worries about, getting a job as a convicted felon, what other what other
Housing.
obstacles have you run into?
Housing.
Yeah, that's the big one.
Yeah,
comes up.
that was not a big thing in the Northeast. I didn't really have problems with that in like New York and New Jersey, but here,
Welcome to Texas.
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. I live in an apartment complex that I usually describe to people as like, oh, this is where such and such got murdered. Because like that's the way most lawyers are familiar with the location I'm talking about. Because someone's on death row for a crime in my complex. But I was trying to move someplace that was, slightly less crappy, and discovered that I really couldn't. It was really difficult with background checks. And then there's just weird times that it comes up, like Airbnb. You can't have an Airbnb.
Like you can't own one or you can't rent one.
Can't rent one. I've been like rejected from like volunteer work and like libraries, SPCA, that type of stuff. Just random stuff, like times you don't necessarily expect it to come up. Or like to do a ride along, like with HPD. I actually had to get that was a no felons rule, but the chief quite nicely agreed to let me do a ride along anyway. But I mean, like I had to, you have to jump through extra hoops on random things.
Yeah.
So.
Now, are you? I mean, you're done with everything. You're not
Yes,
on
I'm off
parole or
parole.
anything
No,
or anything like that. So, talk about that experience, because I mean, you probably couldn't leave the state of New York.
Right. Parole was so nerve-wracking. Just because, I mean, you can really just be thrown back in prison on a whim. It doesn't have to be something valid. Mm-hmm. It can really just be that your parole officer's like having a bad day, more or less, I mean, and mine was great. I did not have any of those kinds of problems. But, I mean, I certainly know people that did that, would get thrown back in for 90 days for being 15 minutes past curfew. But, I was really lucky. I got a job while I was on parole, and it required being out past curfew regularly, and he was cool with that. You needed permission, like, every time just to leave the county even, which, I lived in, like, the middle of nowhere at that point, so that was, like, all the time. I mean, there's obviously a lot of rules, but it's not even, like, the following the rules that's the hardest part. It's just, like, the constantly knowing that you can be thrown back in for pretty much nothing. Like, I mean, if you're jaywalking and you get stopped, you can go back to prison for that. I mean, and I'm speaking about New York. I don't think it fundamentally works different in most states, but obviously my specific experience was in New York.
And how long were you on parole?
2 years.
2 years. Okay.
Yeah.
And I mean, you're supposed to get a job as part of parole, and
Yes.
here you are as a convicted felon, and it's difficult to get a job, I would imagine. So,
Yes.
how did you overcome that? What was the steps that you did to?
I went on Craigslist. I started writing like online trivia for some like Korean quiz site,
Yeah.
and then
In
some
Korean or in English?
definitely not in Korean. And then there was an editor at a paper in Ithaca that was writing about county jail inmates who'd gotten boarded out to other counties, because when they were overcrowded, they'd send you to another county, but it disproportionately affected the women because they had just fewer blocks reserved for women. So she was looking for anyone that had been boarded out, and I'd been boarded out a few times. So she interviewed me and I was like, hey, I Googled you. You seem like you can write. Do you want to write for us? So I started covering planning board meetings in a town with like 5,000 people. It was, not exciting.
Yeah, I can imagine that was like watching paint dry.
Yeah.
How were you received by your colleagues at the Chronicle? I mean, a lot of them probably had done their research in this day and age, and being good reporters, they're probably like, who's this new girl coming in? What's up with her? So tell us what the reception was like over at the Chronicle.
It was fine. I mean, yeah, I don't know. That was not an issue at all. I mean, I do have in my Twitter bio that I'm a felon, so,
Yeah.
I mean,
No surprise.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, when I got out of prison, I initially hadn't decided whether I was going to be like open about this. I mean, it had been written about. It had been a large bust for that area. So like, and because I was in college at the time, like it was like, Cornell student gets arrested. Right. So like Huffington Post or Washington Post or somebody, like, it had been written about some. It was out there. But I hadn't decided whether I was going to, like, continue talking about it or not. And then the local paper was writing about heroin, and they were like, hey, and we're going to include you whether you like it or not. So if you don't agree to, interview with us and talk about it more, we're just going to use what we wrote a couple of years ago. And they were like, we're going to use your mugshot if you don't give us a better picture. I was like, all right, I'm interviewing. We're good.
I'm going to find a mermaid picture.
Right, exactly.
But the difference, obviously, today and when you were getting out and all that, it's the internet. I mean, these stories are out there. They live in perpetuity, so you can't run from it. It's not like 30 years ago where.
But I think it's beautiful that you're not running from it, and that you're embracing it and like informing. Think of all of the information that you've just given us about things that even I, as a defense lawyer, maybe didn't even think about as consequences for clients who have a felony record, like Airbnb. I didn't even think that might be a potential consequence, but I think it's a beautiful thing that you're, telling the world about it. And I wanted to use that to segue in. What do you think, like, fundamentally you love about your work now? And what is it that you want people to know about the work that you do now, thinking about that history?
Well, I mean, obviously one of the things that I like about what I do is that I've got a lot of freedom to explore things that I think haven't been covered as much traditionally. Either at the Chronicle or in a lot of mainstream media. I think that there's a lot of criminal justice reporting that it's kind of a wide open field in Texas in some ways. Like, given the size of the state, you would sort of expect there to be more reporters working in this space. I mean, in New York, you have criminal justice reporters tripping all over each other because you have so much media in New York. And here, I feel like it was really a wide open field to cover. So it's been great to be able to consistently find new territory that hasn't really been covered.
Do you think there's something different about this field in Texas than there is maybe in New York, other than the, number of reporters that there are in New York?
Yeah, I also think that just the fact that when you look at the prison system, and the state as a whole, that it's so spread out. I mean, to us here in Houston, most of the prison units don't feel local, even though they're filled with people from Harris County. Mm-hmm. And I think that's true of any city, like Dallas, Austin. They can look at any prison and be like, that's not local news to us. So I think that the prison system as a whole gets less coverage as a result of that.
Do you think it also has anything to do with historically, obviously New York is a much more liberal state than Texas, and so there seems to, for a much longer period of time up there than down here, the press has been more antagonistic with law enforcement. There often was a time here, I think, that the press might look away on certain things that happened or didn't cover and report with vigor, police abuses and stuff like that. I think that's changing now. But do you perceive that may be what has driven it here in Texas versus New York?
I'm not sure, because I feel like then you would still expect to see a lot of sort of like positive feature-y stories about law enforcement and prisons and DPS. Mm-hmm. And there's some of that, but it's not like that is filling the gap in terms of like the difference between coverage here and there.
Interesting.
I remember the first time I went to a TDC prison, it was a very sobering experience. Do you have like an experience that comes to mind that for you was a defining moment, like, oh my God, this is criminal justice in Texas, or this is what we're dealing with, like this is what I have to report about? Is there a moment that kind of made that impact on you?
I think a lot of it is like fundamentally like not that different from New York. Obviously there's a lot of differences as to like the specifics of how criminal justice works, but sort of the experience of going through the system and doing time and being on parole is not that different. One of the things I was surprised about is some of the ways in which Texas has been more progressive than New York. They use a lot less solitary confinement in state prisons here than they did in New York, and that's changing some in New York as a result of lawsuits and policy changes. But just looking at the raw numbers, like they use it a lot less here in Texas. Also, like bond amounts. Like when I look at bond amounts are actually a lot lower here than they would be for the same thing in New York in a lot of instances.
Do you think it was before the lawsuit or after, or just in general?
In general, I think that was true before as well. And I not so much for the lower offenses. I mean, the lower offenses a lot of times I think are things you would just get ROR'd for in New York. But like murder, you'll see murder charges with like 50,000 bond. Like that'd be like $1 million in New York. I mean, at least in the counties that I had any experience with, and I'm not sure that's universally true. It's probably not true the same in New York City because I was upstate.
Maybe that has to do with standard of living, I'm guessing, to be different.
It might be. I mean, I don't know.
Not in upstate New York.
Oh,
though.
really? Okay.
Yeah. I mean, New York City, but not.
Yeah, I would think so. And I don't know. I mean, obviously you hear a lot more about what happens and the abuses in New York City here, such as what happens at Rikers and how people have been waiting there for 3 years without a trial.
Right.
That sort of stuff. So, I mean, in terms of, what we get in Texas about New York, it's very rare you get any kind of coverage about what's happening in upstate or other parts of it. It's all about what's happening in New York City. And, I don't think I've ever seen anyone that I can remember have to wait 3 years for a trial in custody here. Not that, I mean, I'm sure there's some, but not that I can remember. I mean, I've had some people
Definitely with other things pending,
right.
I would say.
And I've had cases, obviously, both bond and custody cases that have gotten near the 2-year mark and beyond the 2-year mark in some cases. But I don't think I've ever had one that's gotten to near 3. And that's, I don't know. It's a tough. The bond issue is so tough because, we see what's going on here and you have a whole different perspective of it because you're like, well, I mean, some of these bonds are even lower than what you would get in normal parts of the country. And I'm like you, I don't think there's much of an income disparity between upstate New York and here, really.
Right.
I mean, certainly the standard of living in Manhattan is off the charts compared to here. But I would think, you were in Ithaca?
Yeah.
I mean, I can't imagine. It's probably got a lower standard of living than Houston.
I mean,
in terms of, what it would cost to live.
Ithaca's a little bit expensive because there's colleges that drive up the cost of living there. But, but I mean, most of upstate New York is pretty dirt cheap to live.
Yeah. I mean, there are pockets of Houston that are ridiculous in terms of costs.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, in terms of getting an apartment, I mean, some of these apartment complexes that go online are, $3,000 a month for a 1-bedroom. It's like,
yeah,
those are New York City prices we think, when they're really not. Probably, it's a bargain compared to that. I want to kind of talk about your latest article that came out, and that was about the inmate who committed suicide in the Harris County Jail. We've heard stories like this before. Obviously, the biggest one that got the most attention was Sandra Bland out in Waller County, and now you've written about this inmate here in the Harris County Jail. And as I understand it from reading your article, she had basically committed. She was a mental health patient, had mental health problems, and she had warned jailers she was having problems, and they essentially did nothing about it. So tell us a little more about what you found out in your investigation.
So first of all, she was the second of 2 suicides in the past month. I think it's worth mentioning, in very different circumstances. And I mean, other than learning that she had a mental health history and that she had, in some capacity, made the jail aware of her, suicidal ideations, at least. I mean, other than that, we just don't have a lot of answers yet because I mean, it's up to Texas Rangers and the state commission to come up with their findings on this.
Now, did she, if I remember, she had a $1,500 bail that she couldn't make?
Yes. It was a theft charge, but it was felony because, she'd had so many priors. And then they gave her a PR bond the day she died. But I haven't gotten clarification as to the timing of that and why that happened. I mean, I would assume that was because she was already in the hospital at that point and not just because they couldn't make it happen sooner. But
can you explain for our viewers who may not be familiar with the Harris County Jail and the policies of the jail, what it means to make the jail aware of any mental health problems or suicidal ideations, and what responsibilities that might create for the jailers?
so I don't know in what capacity she made them aware. I don't know if she told them, hey, I'm going to kill myself, or if she just talked about it to another inmate. Like, they haven't offered that kind of clarity. And given that there's, still a pending investigation into it, I wouldn't expect to get any sort of official clarity on that at this point. But I mean, obviously, if you've made the jail aware, then they do have some responsibility. I mean, there's various levels of, suicide watch, or like, being on every 15-minute watch. I mean, there's different ways of dealing with this, but she was in a mental health step-down unit. So, I mean, they were clearly aware that there were some mental health issues. But I feel like I should say that, like, in my coverage of the jail in the past year, they've been, the leadership that I've dealt with there seem to really consistently care about dealing with mental health issues for inmates. So a lot of the people that I interviewed in the course of this story, a lot of the, advocates and experts commented consistently on how surprising it is to see this happening someplace like the Harris County Jail, because it's not the kind of jail that has a reputation for not caring,
Do you have any information? I personally went to the funeral of a former client who allegedly committed suicide at the jail, who I had seen a couple days before, and he was laughing. So I don't know what mental health issues he had at the time, because it had been years since I had talked to him or dealt with him. But do you have any data on the number of deaths and or suicides at this jail?
Yeah, it's actually significantly below the national average. Oh. I want to say it's 15 in the past decade, but I don't have the data in front of me. But the rate per 100,000 inmates is less than half the national average.
Wow. See, that's something I think that would interest a lot of people to know, because I think there's kind of a misconception out there that our jail does very poorly on those issues.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of if you ask any of us, I mean, that's kind of the belief around the courthouse, is that our jail is pretty poor on those issues.
I mean, I feel like they're trying. They've been, pretty I mean, obviously, I have a very particular perspective on it, because as media, I realize that they're probably going to be more responsive to me than random person calling. But this morning when I came into work, I had a letter from an inmate saying that he wanted to kill himself, and I put in a call, and I mean, I think they dealt with it pretty quickly. I mean, I got a call back within like 2 minutes. Yeah. So they took it seriously. I mean, it was just a random letter, but they took it seriously and acted right away.
And obviously she had already been diagnosed with mental health issues. There's other people that this has happened to that have had mental health issues. But I'm curious, how much does depression play into potential things like this too? I mean, she had been in custody 3 weeks. So setting aside the mental health, I mean, what, in your own personal experience, did you witness people have bouts of depression aside from just, schizophrenia or anything like that just kind of developed from being in confinement for so long?
Yeah, and I mean, and a lot of people come in with, I mean, maybe it's not something as severe as schizophrenia, but, I mean, a lot of them come in with, at the least, they, have often led very traumatic lives. Through drug use, or, I mean, typically if you've been arrested, if you've gotten to the point of being arrested, if you've been in and out of jail, like, you've been through a lot of traumatic situations, aside from any mental health issues that might exist. And yeah, I mean, at one point the inmate in the cell next to me tried to kill herself. When I was this was, I guess, 2011. And I mean, she hadn't seemed like she was doing particularly badly, but she was known to have mental health issues. But in that case, there was an officer that was close to her. He would come in and check on her regularly, because those two just got along, and he noticed and intervened.
Do you feel like you've had the experience of being on the other side of this? Do you feel like the complaints or the grievances or the feedback that the inmates would give, or your fellow inmates would give, would go on deaf ears? Or do you feel like that they were taken seriously and like given resources when they asked for help?
I mean, it entirely depends on the facility. I mean, it can depend on the shift within the facility, you know. I mean, because if you have someone working that area of the cell block that just doesn't care, then, you know, there's not a lot of recourse. But yeah, so I mean, it varies a lot by facility, by officer, by cell block, by shift.
Man, it's just, I don't know, it's such a difficult issue because, I mean, like for you and so many others who you went in on it basically for an addiction problem. I mean, in essence, that's what it is. I mean, that's what drug possession charges are, in my opinion. I mean, you know, it's somebody who has an addiction problem at the end of the day. And I mean, a lot of this stuff, it just like the mental health, I don't think it gets treated properly, and it leads to a lot of problems. So.
Yeah, because as
Very
a society, we have
Yeah.
to decide, do we want to treat addiction as a disease and really like put in the
Exactly.
effort to deal with it the way it needs to be dealt with? Or do we want to keep funneling all this waste of resources and money into the criminal justice system to punish people for a disease that maybe we could treat on the front end if we reallocated resources? But you have the gift of having witnessed that personally and now as a reporter from both sides. So is there anything that you think that, I know that there's probably a lot, but is there anything that you think your readers should know about specifically people charged with drug offenses and how they're treated when they're in custody and what that means for you personally, having lived it?
Wow, that is such a big question. I don't even know where to start with that one.
She likes
Can you narrow
to
that
ask
down a little
questions.
bit?
I guess if I was going to bring it down, I'd say if we are looking at addiction as a disease and you have the unique experience of having lived that disease, both as maybe an addict and as an inmate and now as a reporter, is there something that you see that we could be doing as a society differently? Maybe it's just a small thing, like in the way we think of these people or the way we think of our clients that have drug offenses that could make the difference. Or maybe as a society, how we think about drug addiction or drug charges.
So I think the most common question that I get along these lines is usually from families who are struggling with, you know, someone who's in an active addiction. And I mean, I feel like it's important to understand that, you know, that every addict and every addiction is different for one. So like, I can't give like blanket advice on like, this is how you manage this client. But I mean, for families, I think it's a little bit easier what to tell them in that, you know, I usually say that, you know, you can be there for the person when they're done, you know, like you can support them. I mean, there, you know, there's a discussion as to at what point you're enabling them or not, you know. I don't know. I mean, my parents still helped me some financially when I was using, like, probably would have been considered like somewhat enabling, but it also kept me from being like
Dead?
living on the street,
Yeah.
you know. Like, I mean, there's, you know, I try not to give like blanket advice on that, but I mean, I think it varies a lot by person, and you know, you have a better sense of your situation than any person on the outside will.
See, to me, I mean, this is the issue I've always had, is that if you are just merely possessing and you are a user, the only crime you're committing is against yourself, you know? And to straddle someone with a felony because they were a user, to have to put up all these barriers, such as not being able to get an apartment, not being able to rent an Airbnb, not being able to, you know, possibly go to law school and sit for the bar, just because they got addicted to a drug or decided to use a drug and got caught with it by a cop. I mean, it's just ridiculous in my mind. I mean, dealing, okay, I understand that. If you're addicted and you go out and your addiction causes you to steal or, you know, do property damage or something like that, that's one thing. But if it's just a pure, you know, I'm caught with drugs, I'm just tired of seeing those cases. I mean, I just think it's ridiculous.
That's why we need more people like you to
Yeah.
show the world that we don't need to care, like as a society, if I'm a landlord, if you have that conviction. You know what I mean? Like if we stop caring so much as a society, I think that maybe you could weigh in, but I think that would make a big difference.
I actually want to go back to what you were just saying.
Yeah.
in terms of like dealers versus users, I think there's this sort of broad conception that those are like two distinct categories.
Oh
and
no,
they're
and
so not.
They aren't. Well,
like-
there's a distinction within the dealer category too. I mean,
Right,
Yeah.
yes.
Because there are people who are just pure dealers.
Right. But I feel like everyone who's using, if you're using long enough, you're dealing at some point to
Right.
some degree.
I agree.
You know.
I
For
agree.
survival.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, I mean, to pay for your own addiction.
Sure.
I mean, if
Right.
the choice is that you're going to be a middleman or you're going to start selling versus, robbing houses,
Yeah.
so I think that I get a lot of emails and a lot of feedback to that effect that, expressing some level of sympathy for users, but I mean, there's not some fine line between the two.
No, totally agree with you on that. I totally agree with you on that. I mean, I think, and this is always the rub. I mean, where does if you're going to start making concessions and start to make reforms, where do you draw the line, right? Where does the line actually? Where do we need to move the line to? And that's a hard call. I get it. I mean, but that's why I think that there needs to be more of a individualized analysis versus, let's just take them and like in your case, put them away for 2 years. I mean, that's just a waste, I mean, thank God you've been able to do what you've done now, but I mean, there are some people who can't overcome it. I mean, they can't overcome the conviction, and it's very difficult for them. And, it's terrible because all they did was use drugs.
Okay, I'm going to play devil's advocate and just ask this question. Do you think that your
Make sure it's short.
It's short. Do you think that your conviction in your prison time helped you become the professional that you are today? Like if it hadn't happened, I know that's like a really hard question, but sometimes you hear people say that, man, if I didn't go to jail, I mean, it saved my life. I tend to not believe that to be true just because of my profession, but since you've experienced it, what do you think? Did it help change something in your life for the better, or is it just something you had to do?
The totality of what I've been through obviously has, put me where I am today and given me the, understanding that I have, but I am not one of those people who's going to be like, yay, jail got me sober.
Yeah.
I think I was at a point where anything would have gotten me sober. I think going to rehab would have done it. I think if I just graduated college and moved out of town and moved on, I was finally at a point where I was really sick and tired of what I was doing. Getting arrested happened to be that thing, but I think there could have been numerous things that could have happened at that point that I would have gotten sober. And I think conversely, if I'd gotten arrested a year earlier, I would have just kept using in jail because, you can get heroin delivered to your bedside in jail, So I think I was just at a point where I was finally sick and tired of the way I was living.
I mean, that's the thing to me. You watch a show like Orange is the New Black, and for us who have been criminal defense lawyers and we've heard the stories from our clients, and you go in and, I mean, you don't see everything, but you can see how stuff could occur. I mean, it's almost like you put someone into an environment where there's even more crime going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally.
I mean, this is not a place, we need to send people to prison to reform them. It's like, Dad, I don't think, if that's your reasoning behind it, that's not the best one, because it just seems like there's a lot of stuff going on in there that's not going to actually aid in reforming people from coming back out and reoffending.
And probably make them worse, I think, in a lot of instances. I don't know.
I mean, I think that depends on the facility a lot and the culture of the facility. I mean, there's some specific units where there's a lot of fighting and a lot of drugs, and there's some where there's not as much. So I think so I think that can vary a lot. But regardless, I mean, you're coming out with a felony, and that doesn't vary.
Hey, guess what? Your fan club is calling in.
Oh, God.
I know. So we're going to take our first call for the evening. Hello, thanks for calling Reasonable Doubt.
Hey, Jimmy, it's Rob Fickman. How are you?
I'm great. How are you doing, Rob?
Good show.
Thank you.
And I appreciate Keri's reporting. It's very important stuff she's reporting on. I just wanted to make two observations, just I guess, historic. One is the jail, like Keri was talking about how she notified the jail about somebody that was threatening suicide. I remember years back when I had a client that I thought was suicidal, calling and sending faxes and such to the jail, trying to get their attention on a client. and 24 hours later, nobody'd done anything. So I think there is and I hate to compliment anybody in law enforcement. There's a
I know it's a real struggle for you.
I know. I think that there's a greater sensitivity in many areas of law enforcement about people that are mentally ill on the one hand. On the other hand, there's still a lot of there's a long way to go. We have people out on the street who street cops are warned are mentally ill, and they still end up shooting people that they should not shoot. I had a client a few years ago who was warned that the client was mentally ill, and rather than bringing out somebody that was a negotiator who could talk to a seriously mentally ill person, they shot and killed my client. And, of course, the cops got no bill. So, well, we've made progress. We shouldn't pat ourselves too much on the back, or law enforcement too much on the back, because there's still a long way to go in terms of this meeting place where law enforcement properly treats people that are mentally ill through no fault of their own. And I think the same thing goes, and it's equatable when we talk about people that are addicted to drugs. Law enforcement still has a long way to go there. I just wanted to make those observations, and appreciate your guys' show tonight. It's interesting topics.
Great. Thanks.
Okay, and one other thing I can tell you. The judges still are very punitive against people. I know we have courts to help people on drug addictions, but many of the judges are still very vindictive and punitive against people who have dirty urines and stuff. And rather than trying to help those people, the judges use any kind of dirty urines and such like that as an excuse to punish people, oftentimes just because they're mean-spirited. I wouldn't miss an opportunity to badmouth bad judges. Good night.
We know you wouldn't miss that.
Good on you, Rob. Yeah.
Bye.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah. How much of your, I know you've done a lot of reporting about the jail and what goes on over there, but when do you think are you interested in actually going and covering trials, criminal trials?
Whenever Brian Rogers is too busy to.
Yeah.
I mean, we have a courts reporter, so.
I know, but he's only one person. There's a lot of courts going on. He can't cover them all. I mean, I'd like to.
I have a few on my calendar for the next few months, so yeah.
Yeah, I love Brian. I love his reporting and everything, but I'd be interested to get your takes too on some of this stuff.
Is there a particular trial you think I should be covering?
No. I mean, I don't know.
All of them.
And I think the other thing too, Brian does a very good job of covering the trials and the sentencing hearings that are big. But I do think it would be interesting to let the public know kind of what happens in some of these other cases, the ones that aren't cause celebs for the city, the dirty fingernail cases, just to see how everything goes on. I mean, I know, and I'm not going to ask your opinion because I know you have no opinion on Manafort and the whole Trump investigation and Russian collusion. But from a standpoint of what the public is actually learning about how the federal criminal justice process works, I mean, I think it's almost an expose in some ways.
And I think Mr. Fickman made a good point, because there's a lot of people that have mental health issues that are on the street, that are homeless or maybe not, that are picking up a lot of these misdemeanor offenses. And maybe now, since the bail lawsuit, they're getting PR bonds or getting reasonable bonds. But there are trials that are probably happening that the public should know about for a lot of these mentally ill / potentially homeless people that maybe don't get covered by the Chronicle. I'm just saying, it might be a thing.
We're
Might be.
Guys, I had 3 stories in today's paper. How many more do you want?
We need you.
I
Keri.
know,
We need
I
you.
know.
Yes. Did you find out? So I guess I wanted to ask you about, since Jimmy had mentioned Sandra Bland, and I know that for her they had put together. And Jimmy, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they had put together like an investigation team that pulled people from different backgrounds. Like there were some criminal defense lawyers.
Correct.
Did they form such a team in these 2 suicides that just happened this past month? Or do you know anything about who's investigating?
I mean, the Rangers are investigating.
Okay, and that's it?
I think, I want to say, you know what, I'm going to have to refer you to my story.
Okay.
I think there's
Got it.
I think there's other people investigating, but I mean, the Rangers are taking the lead from what I understand.
Okay.
And I think that the first one was pretty straightforward. Like they did the required checks. He managed to do it between that time frame. And even though there was clear indications that he had recently attempted suicide because he slashed his own neck, he was telling them that he was not suicidal. So I think that one is a little more straightforward, that they're, initial indications anyways would appear to be a little more straightforward with that one. With the other one, I'm not so sure, because that happened in a common area. And she'd apparently warned someone in some capacity. So I think that one's a little less straightforward. But, it's really early on, obviously. So, we'll see what shakes out in an investigation.
And of course, one of your stories today in the paper was about the prison guard who has resigned over the molestation allegation. And I'm curious your thoughts. There's been, obviously over the past year, we've seen what they call the Me Too movement, with people coming out with sexual assault stories and that are sometimes years, and we've even seen males come out with it, both hetero and homosexual stories of sexual assaults on men that have occurred. But what's not getting attention is that sexual assault still happens in prison, and people don't seem to want to talk about that.
I wrote about it.
And I know that's why I bring it up, because you are one of the few writing about it. And so the counterpoint is out there that we've got this whole groundswell of support for that, but people still don't take prison assault, sexual assault, and molestation claims as seriously as they seem to in a Hollywood context even.
Right. Well, and there's degrees with that, because because you have the one aspect of it is officer on officer, but it's just a totally different kettle of fish when the victim is an inmate.
Right.
Because nobody believes inmates as a whole generally. You know?
Yeah, it's unfortunate, because I think that as an inmate, or even as an accused, before you've become convicted, you start behind the 8 ball on credibility.
Yeah,
and,
totally.
and who's going to believe you? But it's almost as if the attitude is, well, they're in prison. Why should we care? Why should we care if they're getting sexually assaulted by another inmate? Doesn't matter to me.
Or by an officer.
Yeah, or by one of the guards. There just seems to be this, well, it's in prison, so it's not the same. And I wanted to get kind of your thoughts on that, and I know you wrote an article on it, and it's what can we do to bring more people? Because that's one of the main concerns. People ask you before they go in. One of the big things that clients ask you, they are very concerned about being sexually assaulted when they get to a prison.
Well, I think the dynamics of that are entirely different in men's prisons. I'm guessing this is a concern that comes most frequently from, male clients.
No, it comes from both, actually.
Okay.
It actually comes from both.
Yeah, I think the dynamics of how it works are very different with, whether you're in a men's prison or a women's prison. But, the one thing I noticed here is that I feel like there's a lot more, there's a lot more claims of officers getting sexually harassed here than I remember surfacing in New York. And, obviously it's hard to definitively compare them in any way, because, it's just based on sort of, who's talking and reporting on it. But, that was one thing that I thought was interesting here in TDCJ.
Yeah. And so, what do you think? Where does this latest probe stand?
He resigned pretty quickly. We did not publish the video, but there was video released.
Where was the video from, just for viewers?
Okay, so
a regular person.
This was at a state prison in Jasper. There's a woman who was visiting her fiance and said that she'd been fondled by a prison guard who was searching her vehicle on the way in. And the first time she didn't say anything because she didn't have any proof of it, and then she went back another time and got cell phone footage. It's you can't tell whose hand it is. It's he's fondling her breast. It's not some horrible graphic
Smoking gun
right.
kind of video.
Exactly.
Okay.
not to minimize what's happening, but in terms of videos that we wouldn't publish for being too graphic, this is not one of the most graphic ones we've gotten.
But this was just a lady that was going to visit.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So
this was not.
We don't know what that particular employee may or may not have been doing within the walls. I mean, if this is something that he was fondling breasts outside the doors, then who knows, right?
But he admitted and resigned pretty quickly, and I guess OIG is still investigating.
So this as a human being and not somebody who's been in the prison system personally, I always wonder, we put so much money into prisons. We pride ourselves on technology. As a community, we have law enforcement. They wear body cams a lot of times. What is your opinion on surveillance inside these prison systems? What is going on with like video cameras? Are they being used? Is the footage like being secreted? Am I just thinking like a conspiracy theory here, or is it just non-existent? Like people just don't record?
Well, I mean, I am not able to get it through a public information request. I'll tell you that. That's all that matters in my book. I can't get it. I don't actually know how much of these facilities are, are on camera, because that varies a lot by system and by facility. I mean, in New York, like all of the jails, everything was on camera, and the prisons were kind of mixed. And I don't know what percentage of TDC is actually on camera, but I do know that I cannot get any of it.
So what do they tell you? So for the viewers, what is a Public Information Act request, or like a FOIA? Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah.
What is that?
That's when you put in a formal request to get a specific type of information from, a state agency, county department, whatever, from the government in some capacity.
Why is that important as a regular human being, citizen of the community, that you should be able to do that? Or as a reporter?
Well, I mean, as a reporter, that's how that's how you verify claims. That's how you report stories. Like at one point, I got a leaked email saying that there was a quota system for disciplinary violations in TDCJ, and that some major had implemented a quota system that officers had to write up a certain number of inmates per day. But this was a leaked email. You can't just publish off of a leaked email that you can't verify. So I put in a public information request to get any emails between this person and this person on this day, and any other emails in the chain. And I got those, and that showed that yes, they
backed it up.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Does the paper help you when you kind of hit a wall with these requests? Is there anything the paper can do to like sort of help push through that wall?
Yeah. So if the state denies a request, or if the agency you're requesting denies the request, they have to send it up to the Attorney General for a decision. So at that point, you can write in a letter saying that you think you should get the information for this reason. Sometimes we write letters when it comes to that. Sometimes I don't write letters, and I'm just pleasantly surprised when the AG sides with me anyway.
Oh, nice.
We got a question coming in from one of the viewers. It says, have you heard anything about the jail over in Louisiana and conditions over there where Harris County inmates are being taken over to Louisiana
Yes.
to be housed awaiting trial? Have you heard anything about the conditions over there? Any stories you're working on about that?
We are working on a story, but it's I'm not the lead writer on it, so I'm not going to ruin that reporter's story. But yes, look for that.
That's happening. And I
You're
had...
going to leave the viewer hanging.
Yeah, I had a client
Firing
tell
minds
me
want to know.
that they would not tell the family that they were in Louisiana. Now, I don't know if they did that
Oh, I
because
don't know.
of
I haven't had-
security reasons that they don't say, but I had a client recently tell me that when his fiance was trying to find out where he was, that they would not say that he had been taken to Louisiana, because he ended up telling me, and I had no clue that they were doing that.
I haven't gotten any reports of that.
Okay, that's interesting.
A lot of lawyers didn't know either that
Yeah.
the clients had been moved.
Yeah, I mean,
I know that.
I had that.
We could probably hook you up with some lawyers to talk to
Oh,
about
excellent.
that. We know a few people.
I know me. That happened to me. I'll tell you, yeah.
Okay.
Man, I wanted to talk, we're getting a little short on time. I wanted to talk a little bit about this Colorado murder case. I mean, this thing's crazy to me. What are your initial thoughts on it? Because this guy...
I don't know. I've been knee deep in jail suicides.
Man.
I honestly haven't followed that.
I mean...
Tell us a little bit about it, Jimmy.
So this guy in Colorado apparently has murdered or was accused of murdering his 2 daughters, his wife, who was pregnant, and then burying his wife, and then stuffing the girls in oil tanks. I mean, it's just a bizarre story. And you know, they did a TV interview with him about them going missing, and he just wanted them back, wanted his family back. I mean, it's a fascinating story, and I'm following it because I know one of the reporters up in Denver who's actually covering the story, and so I'm like,
what made him
crazy.
like suspect? Just because he's the daddy?
He was having an affair. The
well.
typical things that make you start to look at the husband in the case, you know, there's an affair,
Having an
there's
affair.
motivation, that sort of stuff. So I think that's how they started looking at him. There's been no announcement yet about whether or not they're going to seek the death penalty. And, you know, I mean, I don't know where you stand on it, whether you're for or against the death penalty.
I'm a reporter who covers it, so I definitely can't share, opinions on that.
Yeah, I mean, but to me, I mean, this is just such one, and having two young kids, I'm just like, I just couldn't imagine. Like,
Well,
to me,
what's the evidence though, Jimmy? Just because when you said that, it kind of felt like Michael Morton a little bit. Because can you imagine when Michael Morton's
confessed.
story
That's the
came
biggest
out?
evidence
Oh, okay,
so
so
far.
that's a
Yeah.
big difference.
so
big
that's the big
difference.
one, is there's a confession.
Thank you for sharing that bit. That makes a big difference. Okay,
Yeah,
confession.
yeah.
Got
So,
it.
you know, now they've come out and he's trying to say that the daughters were actually killed by the mom, and he saw her choking them on the baby cam. It's just a bizarre explanation, but so it's kind of backtracking from his confession.
What does it
Very
take to be a
strange.
capital murder there?
I don't know. That's a good question. I would imagine this, if you know, just like here, since there are multiple murders, that would probably constitute it.
I mean, unless you can cast enough doubt on who actually.
Right, which is
kids.
probably one. But see, the triggering factor there is too. The wife was pregnant.
Pregnant.
So you get
Right. Okay.
no matter. So it doesn't really work. I mean, if he's admitted to killing the wife in passion for the kids, maybe that could fly. But and that's why he's asked for DNA samples from the necks of the kids.
That might work. Epithelial DNA samples might work.
After they've been buried in an oil tank.
You'd be surprised, Jimmy. I don't know.
You're the
but
DNA expert.
I'm saying it could happen. It
Carrie,
would just depend
If you need DNA,
how degraded
the
it
go-to.
was. Yes.
I rely on her to make me smarter on DNA.
It's it's evolving science, but it could be. I'm sure they would get some mixture samples from it.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I'm being told we are out of time.
Oh,
For
that
this evening.
flew by.
I know, right?
That flew by.
How was it compared to the last time you hosted?
Well, I like being over here and hanging out, and I definitely enjoyed listening to Keri, and I can't wait to read more of her stories. I hope that everybody does. We could use some of that enlightenment, I think.
I hope you'll come back.
Sure.
Awesome. That's what I like to hear. So that's all the time we have left for this evening, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank Keri Blakinger for coming on and spending an hour with us. And I think it's been fascinating. I hope you found it fascinating as well. And I really appreciate Victoria filling in
Thank you, Jimmy.
on the heels of your surprise wedding that you didn't tell me about.
Thank you.
So we'll talk about that off air. But that's all the time we have, ladies and gentlemen. Good night. We'll see you next week for another episode of Reasonable Doubt.